What's going on, everybody? It's Chip Walton. Welcome to Chop and Brew. In this episode, we're getting pro tips from Imperial Yeast on fermenting high gravity lagers. We're talking Imperial Pilsners, IPLs, Doppelbocks, Baltic Porters, heck, even a Maibach if it's high enough starting gravity. We're talking big beers that you brew now to enjoy a little bit later, and they might take a little bit of extra know-how and work to get you there. In this video, I talk with Adam McClure. He's a technical support specialist at Imperial Yeast to learn about special high gravity considerations for yeast cell count and pitch rate, staggered aeration and oxygenation events, fermentation temperatures, and extended lagering techniques for beers that push 8, 9, 10% ABV and beyond. Plus, the importance of performing both a forced fermentation test and VDK or diacetyl test to help improve the quality of your homebrew. We then walk through a new homebrew recipe that Adam hooked us up with called Collaborator Doppelbock. This will better illustrate some of the techniques we're talking about. That recipe is linked in the video description below, so we hope you check it out, brew it up this winter, and let us know how it goes. As always, these pro tip episodes are brought to you with support from Imperial Yeast with their full lineup of year-round and limited edition lager strains, many of which we will be talking about in the course of this video, and also the always cold, chillin' Patreon party people. Join them at supporting the show. Keep Chop and Brew strong at patreon.com/chopandbrew. What's going on, everybody? I'm here in the porch of Chop and Brew. It is a crazy windy day in Midway St. Paul as winter seems to literally be coming across the country to us right now, which is very applicable to this conversation. I'm here with Adam McClure, technical service support team member for Imperial Yeast. Adam, what up out there in Hood River, man?
Oh, it's all good, man. Thanks for having me on the show. I appreciate it, Chip.
Yeah. So like I just said, winter is fast approaching here and other places. So that's got me kind of thinking of lager brewing, specifically high gravity lager brewing is what Adam's going to help us here with today. I've been thinking about Doppelbocks, Imperial Pilsners, Baltic Porters. But these are all beers that for a person like myself that doesn't do a lot of lagers is just it's a lager, but B, we're talking about the special considerations you might need for a high gravity lager. So Adam's going to walk us through some tips and techniques for getting there. First off, Adam, just like real quick 101 on ale versus lager fermentation when we're just talking about standard strength beers.
Sure. Yeah, so ale fermentations, as a lot of people know, can ferment a warmer range, somewhere in the 60 to 70 degree range. But with ale fermentations, you tend to pick up a lot of ester formation and a shorter fermentation time. And the other thing is with ales, you can go at a lower pitch rate. So typically a 0.75 million cells per mil per degree Plato for worts that are under 17 degrees Plato. The reason is the warmer temperatures just allow the yeast to kind of get their job done easier, I guess you'd say. For lagers, on the other hand, they ferment a lot cooler. So in that kind of 46, 58 degree range. And because of the cooler temperatures, they tend to take longer and they produce less esters, so they're cleaner. But they do actually require a higher pitch rate. So somewhere closer to like a million cells per mil per degree Plato.
And that's just on the standard side.
Yeah, for works under 17 degrees Plato. Yep. Once you start getting into the high gravity stuff, all of that starts to change for both.
Okay, so let's talk about things that are, I'm kind of roughly saying like 1070 OG and higher. Adam also is sharing a Doppelbock recipe with us that we'll talk a little bit more through it as a roadmap at the end of this discussion. But I noticed the OG for that, you call it like 1080 to 1100, kind of leave that range open. So let's just call like 1070 and
Sure.
above. What are the new things we have to think about and kind of the techniques people are going to have to bring in order to pull these beers off?
Yeah, in general, just high gravity fermentations, they're going to have a lot of osmotic pressures. So lager is actually going to have a little bit more because you're dealing with the cold temperature also. So high gravity and cold temperature, potential for a lot of stress. So I guess the key with doing a high gravity lager is just making sure that you get enough yeast cells that are healthy in there the first time, that you give it plenty of nutrient and plenty of oxygen. And that oxygen is really going to help with that initial cell growth to be able to just kind of overcome some of those pressures and tackle the job that they have ahead of them. So what I would probably do if I were fermenting a high gravity, I would shoot somewhere for double the pitch rate. So instead of 1 million cells per mil per degree Plato, I would go with somewhere closer to 2 million cells per mil per degree Plato for an initial pitch rate. And then what I would also do is add a yeast nutrient and then aerate at knockout and at 12 hours after knockout.
When we talk about that pitch rate kind of being doubled, what are your and Imperial's thoughts on that being by way of a starter versus potentially being by way of a smaller beer first and somehow utilizing that pitch?
Yeah, so trying to achieve that pitch rate is going to be a little bit tricky at a homebrew scale. You could either do somewhere around 5 pouches in a 5 gallon batch, or what I would do is actually avoid a starter because the amount of volume that would be required to get that cell count is pretty much a 5 gallon batch anyway. So if it were me, I would just brew a 5 gallon batch, put 1 pouch in, start at around 10 degrees Plato, and that should get you enough cell growth to handle a 5 gallon batch at around 20 degree Plato.
But the first time we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, kind of brainstorming it, you'd also just said, like, it might be a little more expensive, but those pouches will get you there with I should say guarantee results, but should be theoretically guaranteed results.
Yeah. So usually, for 5 gallons around 20 degrees Plato, you're going to need about 1 trillion cells for the whole batch. And if our pouches are at 200 billion, you've got to either grow that up or just pitch 5. And usually, you can kind of calculate that the growth would be about 2.5 times in a typical batch. So hopefully, if everything goes well and you harvest at terminal gravity of a small 5 gallon batch, you should be able to pull off, somewhere around like 0.8 quarts or so, which should put you kind of in that cell count range.
I had asked you something that just kind of theoretically made sense to me, but you instantly were like, no. I kind of thought about like either sugars as part of your wort production process, or what I've known some people to do. And then the more I thought about it, I was like, well, that is usually more on the ale side of things, like barley wines, where they'll do like a dose, a bit almost like a staggered sugar addition, where they're putting honey, candy syrup, straight up sugar, something in at like 24, 48 hours. You say, no, sir, on the lager front.
Yeah. So typically yeast kind of only like to stress out once, I guess you'd say. Multiple sugar additions, once fermentation has begun, tends to just kind of add extra shock, if you will, to yeast. So it's almost better just to go ahead, add the sugar once, add all your nutrient, get your oxygen and pitch rate right, set your temperature, and let them just do their thing.
Temperature. How does that work?
Temperature. Yeah. So temperature is kind of an interesting thing to think about. So the one thing that we kind of really want to do is try to balance our growth rate and how rapid our fermentation goes and the alcohol ester production. But we also don't want to inhibit growth and fermentation. So we kind of have to find this nice balance with temperature. The warmer you go, the better yeast are at growing and metabolizing and doing their thing. The cooler you go, it kind of tends to slow that process down. If we do too much of one or the other, we could actually get a slower, sluggish, or stalled fermentation, or we'll get one with big alcohols that's just way off. So what I kind of tend to like to do to balance it out is knock out at around 46 to 48 degrees and let that just hold for about 48 hours. And what that's going to do is it's just going to try to control that growth a little bit. You got to remember, we're pitching at a really high rate. We've added a lot of oxygen. There's a ton of sugar and nutrient. The potential for it to just rip is pretty high. So keeping that temperature somewhat low is just going to give you steady, slow growth. And then after about 48 hours, we can go ahead and rise our temperature up to that kind of 50, 52, maybe even 54. That might be pushing it. I would say around 52 is probably good for the bulk of your kind of mid fermentation.
What nutrients are we talking about here? You said that twice, and I forgot to ask the first time.
Sure. Yeah. I would say, anything that has zinc for sure is going to help with growth. And then in the high gravity fermentations, having some other minerals and some nitrogen, organic nitrogen sources. So, without throwing out names, I would just say, shoot for a yeast nutrient that has a nice blend of organic nitrogen sources, minerals, and zinc.
You had mentioned kind of a vigorous but controlled fermentation. Can you help people visualize what that literally looks like, or is it more of a tracking your numbers game?
Yeah, so I don't know how many people do, but I feel like it's a pretty good idea to track your gravity and even pH, if possible, for your fermentation. And what you're going to want to see is a pretty rapid drop in your pH over the first 48 hours and a fairly decent drop in your gravity, but mostly you're looking for that pH. And what that's going to be an indication of is just healthy growth and activity and a healthy fermentation. If for whatever reason that pH is sluggish or your gravity is dropping slow, that would be an indication to go ahead and warm your temperature just a little bit and see if you can kind of encourage some of that growth and fermentation. But really, yeah, you should be able to just notice coming off of your blow off enough vigorous activity that you're really blowing off sulfur. I mean, that's kind of what you're going for. To make sure that you're blowing off sulfur. And then, I mean, to be honest with you, when you start getting around like 2 degrees Plato from terminal, even cranking your temperature up to about 65, 68 even is really going to help that yeast just have a strong finish and clean up VDKs.
VDK equals diacetyl, right? For people that, okay. Because I wanted to mention, the first time we talked, it was really cool. You would point out 2 great resources that Imperial have that we can link in the video description, both the VDK/diacetyl test, but before that, the forced fermentation test to even see what, this tells us what potentially this work could get to.
Yeah, so one thing that brewers can do is when they're going to knock out, if they can divert just enough yeast to run what's called a forced fermentation test, or I'm sorry, not yeast, divert enough wort without yeast, hold that sample separate. While your fermentation is going, you can take that forced fermentation sample and add any other yeast, like a dried USO5 or something like that. And there's an SOP on our website that outlines how to do this. But the idea is you're going to run this small sample, you're going to incubate it, and in about 48 hours, you'll get to an actual terminal gravity. And you'll use that as a measurement concurrently with your fermentation that's going on in your tank. And that's going to kind of give you an idea of what percentage of attenuation your fermentation is at. So that kind of, it's just a tool that we use to help determine when to raise that temperature up for the diacetyl rest and finishing terminal, and just to kind of keep track of when we actually hit terminal. So there's just no guesswork there. And then the other test that we also have an SOP for is the VDK test. And so once we hit terminal gravity, once it matches our forced fermentation test, we know it's at terminal gravity. Then we go ahead, give it a couple of days warm for that diacetyl rest. And then we can pull a couple of samples off. And one of those samples we warm up to about 140 degrees for about 20 minutes. and then we let it cool back down, and you compare the two samples. And that, if you get diacetyl, then it's not safe to crash to lagering temperatures. If you don't, then it's cleared, you've passed VDKs, and you can immediately crash down to 32 degrees. There's no real need to step down fermentation temperatures at that point.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting myth that kind of got busted through talking about this. I'd always heard this like 10 degrees a day or every couple of days, and you guys are like, just drop it as fast as you can. What
Yep.
were
Yeah.
those concerns? What was that myth built around a little bit?
Well, the idea is kind of, it was just to avoid, I guess, shocking the yeast into dormancy before everything was cleaned up.
Okay.
And really, I mean, honestly, if you have an appropriate pitch rate and enough oxygen, and you're running a clean fermentation, and you're getting through VDKs, there shouldn't really be anything to clean up. And once the yeast are done, they're done, and it's actually better to just get them out of the tank, out of contact with the beer. As you know, the higher gravity, it's a really stressful environment, and as yeast cells start to die, they start releasing constituents back into the finished beer, and can kind of cause some off flavors. So I don't know. I feel like it's actually it's a give or take, and I feel like just crashing and getting the yeast out of there and racking into a secondary is probably going to produce a cleaner beer.
And then to kind of wrap up the full circle or the timeline, I guess it's a straight timeline, not a full circle, but any additional kind of suggestions for lagering a beer that is 9, 10, 8, 9, 10, 11%? Should we be thinking longer for that, or is that kind of a style thing? Are there any imperial lagers that want to be drank fresh, or is this pretty much a long game kind of proposition that you plan ahead and you enjoy the fruits of your labor much later?
Sure. I mean, there's certainly some conditioning and maturation, that kind of goes on in the lagering lager. You're not going to drink it like right off the bat. You want things to kind of meld and mellow. But again, if you have a real clean fermentation, some of that time can be reduced some. If you don't, then it might require longer. But yeah, I guess what I would probably think about is once you've crashed and you've let it kind of clarify, I guess you'd say, for a few days, racking at that point into a secondary vessel that is clean, sanitized, purged of all oxygen. I would rack into that and just pressurize it to about 2 or 3 psi head pressure, and just go ahead and allow that to sit cold for maybe 2 or 3 months. And at that point, I would rack into another cleaned, sanitized, purged, pressurizable vessel
Okay.
to carbonate and serve.
What's happening at that really low psi that, say, somebody who just kegs, puts it at 12 and lets it sit for a month before they start drinking it? What might they be losing out a little bit?
Well, the thing is if you go into your I guess first secondary vessel and you go ahead and carbonate, right?
Yeah.
You're still going to get settling, like the precipitation of anything that is in there that's just going to go ahead and settle in that container. And so if you pressurize to serving pressure and you pour off of that particular vessel, then obviously those particulates, you run the risk of just pulling particulates into your glass. On the other hand, if you want to transfer into another vessel and you're at that carbonated pressure, you're just going to get a ton of foaming. And so you're going to end up, so you'll end up losing some of potentially the foam positive proteins, and like blowing off, head retention and stuff like that. And so the idea of just holding it at 2 or 3 psi is that it's enough pressure that everything's sealed. You're not going to get oxygen. But it's at a low enough pressure that you can transfer again and have a cleaner beer and then carbonate at that point, so that you don't just get foaming in that second keg.
So you have provided us a recipe that we are going to share with everyone. We're calling it the Collaborator Doppelbock. You kind of piece this together through your own experience as a pro brewer, talking to other brewers, just kind of gathered this through many sources. Tell me about this recipe, and if there's anything kind of specific to this recipe that kind of cuts through the bigger general suggestions we just had.
Yeah, sure. So with this recipe, just it's kind of habit of mine, I guess, to lay out some of the specs that I'm shooting for as far as like OG, TG, rough ABV and BUs, and then kind of operate off of percentages. Like everybody's brew house is going to have different efficiencies and different characteristics. So it's kind of hard for me to just give poundage. But what I would say is for a Doppelbock, I would go with the majority of it as Munich as my base malt with some Pilsner and maybe a Cara Munich. But what I would be looking for most are just real high quality, low protein continental malts. I would stay away from UK or even American malts. Um, and then for hops, just going something around 20 BUs. I would stick with the earlier editions, kind of around a 90-minute or a 60-minute, and use something like a German Tettnang or Hallertau. To be honest, I feel like malts are so highly modified these days and such good quality that really there isn't. I don't see a huge benefit in doing this ultra complex kind of step mashing, even decoction. I know that's like stepping on some thin
Oh,
ice there. I know I don't want to get into big debates, but I just, especially beers this big, I think a single infusion, really just like make it easy, make it fun. I mean, we're just kind of, we're having a good time here. And I think that there's been enough work on the maltsters end to allow us to do that. So really just kind of going with a single infusion mash. I would aim for a liquor to grist ratio that's a little bit on the thinner side. So I would say like, 1.25 quarts per pound or somewhere in there. And really what you're kind of going for there is it's thin enough that you're going to promote some fermentables, but it's not so thin that you're going to limit the extract. So thicker mashes tend to give more extract, but when you're kind of talking about a beer this big, with a high original gravity, you kind of want to keep in mind that higher OGs also lead to higher TGs. So if you kind of want to aim for around that 5-degree Plato terminal, then it's probably better to go with like a little bit of a thinner mash, a little bit lower on the mash pH, so somewhere around like 5.3, maybe 5.4. And then around 154 degrees is good. 154 should balance pretty well between fermentable and not.
and in this recipe, you had that you've kind of talked about your 46 degrees knockout with a dose of oxygen at knockout, and then again that 12 hours kind of right.
Yeah. So what I would do is I would go ahead and whatever your temperature control, if you have a temperature controller with a set point, I would go ahead and set that to about 48 degrees Fahrenheit, but knock out around 46.
Mm.
So that'll allow the yeast to just kind of start cool. It'll come up to the 48. What happens sometimes if you have your set point too low, like say you set it at 46 and you knock out at 46, starts to warm up, you can overcool. So when your cooling turns on, it can cool it down and it would get down to roughly like 44 or 45, which would actually stall the yeast out. So it's better to have your set point slightly higher and knock out slightly cooler to allow it to kind of come up to set point temperatures. And then what I would do also is just aerate. If you have a stainless sintered stone, and the ability to use pure oxygen, I would go, somewhere around zero point 0.3 LPM for about 5 minutes when you knock out before pitching. And then also about 12 hours post knockout, I would repeat that just to give that second aeration event. That's really going to give the yeast what it needs to just kind of keep that cell growth going.
But never a third. We talked about this last time. You're like, that's it. Like oxygen stops at that 12 hour.
Yeah. I would say, you kind of have a little window, 12, sometimes all the way up to 18, but I wouldn't do a third aeration event. And really, the big thing that you kind of have going there is if you start getting some fermentation activity going on and you're dropping, your degrees Plato are starting to drop, then the risk that you run is balancing getting enough oxygen for the yeast, but oxidizing the yeast metabolites. So after about 18 hours, you're kind of running that risk. And honestly, unless you're doing like an extreme high gravity, the two events are more than sufficient.
So people can look at the recipe for kind of some of the other nuts and bolts that kind of match what we've already talked about. Talk to me about the yeast strains for this beer specifically, what you were suggesting people try if they can get on it pretty quick here at the start of this winter.
Yeah, so right now Imperial has our seasonal strain, which is L26 Pilgrimage. It's a great strain for Doppelbocks. The alcohol tolerance is a little bit higher than some of our other strains, so it's about 12%. And if you pitch with enough cells per mil per degree Plato, or if you have a high enough pitch rate and oxygen and do a lot of the things that we've been talking about, you could probably even get away a little bit higher. But it's a real clean strain. It's well balanced. It's super versatile. And I think with this particular style or some of these particular styles, it's going to balance out that malt just a little bit more. It's not going to leave you with this ultra dry, ultra crisp, which, you really kind of want to avoid that with beers with this high of ABV. Otherwise, you just kind of get this like ethanol character that just pops out is really unbalanced. So L26, I feel like, is just going to be a real nice kind of blend for balance malt between the malt and hops and everything. And then second, I would probably go with L17 Harvest, which is also a super versatile strain. It flocks really well, flocks out, settles, clears up. So, going back to the terminal gravity and getting through BDK and crashing, you're going to be able to move this one along pretty quickly with L17. It's going to drop out pretty clear right off the bat. You're not going to be racking a lot of suspended yeast. So it's just a real great strain for making clean lagers. But it also tends to balance some of that malt a little bit more.
Is there any Imperial kind of style or high gravity, I should say? It's always weird when you talk to people from Imperial and you say Imperial and you're like, which Imperial? High gravity lager strain that global, your other kind of powerhouse year rounder would be most suited for?
Yeah. I would say, if you're going with something that is like an Imperial Pilsner, so global it's going to be a little bit powderier. It's not going to want to settle quite as well, but it's going to give you a super clean beer. So what I would probably go for more would be like Imperial Pilsners or like a cold IPA or something like that.
We'd of course be remiss as we look to the next limited edition strain, also lager, because why not? It's winter. The Hygge strain, maybe not the best for high gravity, but what is it best for?
Yeah, the Hygge is gonna really be good for your springtime. Nice, clean, super crisp. Just Pilsner, especially like a more of a Danish style Pilsner lager. That's what I would really be going for with that. I would stay away from more of the maltier, high gravity stuff with Hygge.
Right on. Well, a lot of awesome info, techniques, great technical nerdism, and a recipe to boot, man. Like it's like, oh, it's on Christmas. So yeah, between this recipe and Live Oak kind of gave me the behind the scenes recipe. They have a smoked Doppelbock they call Fumigator. So might be having two attempts at Doppelbocks in the basement because my basement, no joke, half of it's unfinished. So pretty soon here, as the weather's getting into like the highs in the low 30s, we will be rocking like 48. And then I play this game where like The root cell is 48, but as you get
Yep.
closer down the hallway to the one room that has a heater, it's about 56. So like I'm the
There you
classic
go.
like buckets move around my house in order to do like diacetyl rest is upstairs.
Yeah, right.
Crashing this back down.
Oh, that's great. I love it. That's
Yeah.
awesome.
I wish I was more high five.
Well, that's one way of tracking your fermentation, though, right? It's just wherever your bucket is.
Yeah.
No,
Adam,
that's great.
thanks again for everything for the recipe. We actually kind of have maybe a super duper high gravity lager project. The crew of Chop and Brew are cooking up. We won't talk about that because it kind of breaks some of the
Sure,
rules that we've been talking about. But that
sure.
might be something you'll see Adam kind of consulting us on again here as we move into the winter. So, all right,
Yeah,
Adam,
I'd love to.
cheers.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.
thank you so much. Thank you a lot. And obviously, we went over a ton of information. If anybody does have questions with this, I mean, they can always feel free to reach us. Our email addresses are on our website. So happy to dig into anything, more specific.
And the SOPs for both the VDK and the forced fermentation test in the links below, as well as the Collaborator Doppelbock.
Yeah. Thanks, man. Appreciate it. Good
Appreciate
times.
Woo! Plus the importance of performing plus the importance of performing plus the importance of plus the importance of performing both plus the importance of performing both plus the importance of performing both I forgot. Plus the importance of performing both a forced fermentation and VDK or diacetyl test. Adam and I then talked through a new recipe. We then talked through a new recipe. We then talked through a new homebrew recipe. We then walked through a new homebrew recipe for. We then walked through a new homebrew recipe. We then walked through a new homebrew recipe that Adam hooked us up with called Collaborator Doppelbock. This will better illustrate some of the techniques we're talking about.